Okay, hello, and welcome to this eSchool News webinar, 10 Steps to Data Readiness. My name is Kevin Hogan. I am the Content Director for eSchool News, and I am happy you are joining us today for what I know will be a very insightful and important conversation. This event is brought to you by GoGuardian. GoGuardian solutions are built for K-12 and trusted by 14,000 and more schools and districts to create educational environments where every student can thrive. Their GoGuardian suite of classroom management and student safety solutions include EduLastic for assessment, GoGuardian Teacher for classroom management, Pear Deck for student engagement, and TutorMe for personalized learning support. Pardon me. They help schools and districts maximize the learning potential of every student by enabling more productive, effective, and safer digital learning. Now, before we get to our conversation, I'd like to take a minute to go over some of the features of the platform that we're using for this webinar. The event is being recorded, so you don't have to worry about missing a thing. Within a few days, you'll receive an email message that contains a link to the recorded webinar, along with a PDF of the slides. And if you have a question or a comment for us, which I highly encourage the audience to participate, because it really kind of helps the panelists and I get an idea of what you're looking for. There's a chat function that you can use. Feel free to use that also to contact someone from the eSchool News team if you have a technical question. So with these housekeeping items out of the way, let's get started with our conversation and some introductions. First, Erica Hartman joined GoGuardian as the subject matter expert for CTO personas on the RevOps and strategy team. Erica brings over 20 years of teaching and administrative experience as a chief technology officer in public education, helping school districts choose digital platforms that best suit their strategic goals and stakeholders. She specializes in large-scale deployments and implementation, digital architecture of online platforms, data interoperability, digital citizenship, and student safety, always with end user experience and providing actionable data at top of mind. Also with us today, Ryan Heckler. Ryan is an experienced teacher, school administrator, and district leader in private and public K-12 schools. He is also a subject matter expert, but for curriculum and instruction at GoGuardian, where he focuses on empowering educators to drive student outcomes through quality instruction, equitable engagement, and actionable assessment. Ryan previously served as chief academic officer for a high-performing Wisconsin district. As CAO, he was responsible for comprehensive instructional strategy, including curriculum, systems of assessment, priority setting, and professional development. Ryan is a former Teach for America Corps member and holds a master's in educational policy and leadership from Marquette University. So Ryan, Erica, thanks again for joining us today. I know this is going to be a really insightful conversation. And before that acronym that we all now know as AI, data was really kind of the phrase for the groups of folks that we're talking to, which is always front and center. Going back years, even before the pandemic, the idea of using data and how you use data and how do you keep data safe was always a topic that was at times controversial, especially when it came to ideas like data privacy, but always really, really important for any district to have any sorts of success. And so before we get in the weeds, Erica, maybe you can lead us into a little bit of the big picture and where you see the data question from GoGuardian's perspective.
Thanks a lot, Kevin. And Ryan and I are so excited to be here today. I think what's really interesting and eye-opening to me is that districts always come to us and say, we want to put all of our data in one place. And that's a very bold goal. And it takes actually a lot more work than districts think. And, really one person cannot do it alone in a district. And a big takeaway for me from ISTE was that we are now in the age of evidence, right? We have all of this data that we've collected, even more so, coming out of the pandemic because everything has been so digitized. Systems in schools that were not digitized before the pandemic are. So we're having all these points of data, but where do they live? Are they actionable for teachers and stakeholders? And how can we help districts figure out how to make all this data come together in one place and make it really accessible and actionable for everybody in the district? So I always like to kind of start off with just thinking about, where does the data live in your school? If you really start to think about it, it could keep you up at night. There's data everywhere. Who has access to it? It's also really important. Is it just administrators? Is it just teachers? When are we going to give parents and students access to the data? I think that's another big question as well. Is your data siloed? So a lot of times data lives in one place and then in another place, but it's not connected together and it's not easy to read. And then finally, I think the biggest one is just what story does your data tell in your district? Is your district ready to actually look at the data and have transparency around data? So today, Ryan and I are going to kind of bring two worlds together, technology and curriculum, and really talk about why it's important to work together in this to unsilo that data and collaborate, across teams and across systems in a school district on what data story does your district have in mind here. So as I said before, we're going to go over the 10 steps. Data interoperability is a hard word to say. So the cool kids say data IO. So we're going to be saying that today. And I want everyone to know that this process, it's not easy. It's not quick. In my last district, we had a goal of making a dashboard in 2 years. It actually took 6 years to perfect it. And we had to go back many times and start from scratch. And it really all just starts with ripping off the Band-Aid. You just got to start doing it. If not now, when are you going to do it? So I think now it's a good time as ever because we have all this data and we're starting to have companies that can come together and give options and really support us as well. So I guess we'll just dive into it.
Yeah. So, I mean, so here are the 10 steps, right? I mean, not 5, not 15. And we'll just dig right into it. First, when you want to talk about the putting together a team, Ryan, maybe you want to kind of start off and actually the things that Erica say resonate with you. And then where does that come from your POV? And then let's get right into step number 1 in terms of governance teams.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Excited to be here today and speak with you all. And I think there were a couple things that Erica said that just stood out to me so much. And she talked about at ISTE, we're in the age of evidence, right? And I think from the curriculum and instruction side of things, the way that I would frame that is student outcomes are first and foremost. And in my position, in my role, that was I always had to have a why for data, right? Data alone is just a bunch of numbers. And we would tell our staff continually, like, the numbers don't tell you everything, right? There's a student behind that number. But they do give you some great insights as to what's working, what's not, who's being supported and challenged, who might need some additional support. And I think that is why this idea right now of data consolidation and interoperability is so critical, because we have access to more data than we've ever had before in schools. And it has just proliferated over the last 10, 15 years to the point where it can almost be too much noise. And so how do you cut through that and find the things that are most critical to actually advancing student outcomes? So our first step that we're going to talk about today is kind of starting with who's there, who's making those decisions, right? You need to form a governance team. This is not something that one person or two people within a district can do. And there's a number of reasons for that. I mean, one is just the sheer load of work that it takes to make sure you're consolidating, but also I think most critically is like the diverse perspectives that exist within a school are so critical to have represented if you're trying to consolidate data. And I'll say even from the curriculum and instruction side, I'm not even going to creep into Erica's technology world, but like the data that a kindergarten teacher is concerned with is going to be wildly different than PSAT data, right? So thinking about what do we need to get a comprehensive picture of our students, we need to have different voices represented. And so I think that's why it's so critical to start by building a team that is going to allow you to move forward in the best manner possible.
And so are we talking, Eric, I mean, are we talking about administrators, faculty, I don't know, students even, especially maybe when you get to the secondary level, to flesh out what that team can look like?
I think it includes all the above, board members, community stakeholders. Um, I saw in the chat too, we have some special educators in attendance, special education as well. I think really it starts with informing the why. Why are we even creating a data governance team? It sounds like a really like the Secret Service of Education. We're creating a data
Yeah, it's
governance
very
team.
intimidating. Yeah, the
Yeah.
governance. Yeah.
But it's actually really necessary because student data privacy is the number one top concern of especially my persona, a CTO, and also parents, I'm sure. So we want to take a full lens, look at all the data that we're collecting. What are the policies surrounding it, whether it's federal or district? Where does it live? And as a district, what are we committed to? Are we committed to protecting data, making it transparent? And a lot of it just starts with what is data IO, and defining that for people. And then really showing exemplars or examples of all the data that we do collect, because a lot of times stakeholders don't realize that we're collecting all of this data. And I think it's really great to be transparent with what we're collecting and also how it affects them. I think there's a lot of empathy behind it too. I mean, talking about data can be hard depending on why the data is being collected. Some teachers have a lot of questions as to why the data is being collected, or so do parents. And to be able to band together, create a team who can respond to these questions, who can ensure that we're keeping the data safe and private, ensure that our policies are up to date. It actually is a really, really important team to have in your district. And I'm curious, I don't really know the breakdown of schools that have this or districts, but I'm curious to see, maybe in the chat if other schools have really started doing this. Are they at the beginning process of it or even later on? But there's no clear numbers in it yet, but there's a lot of resources out there too, from like Digital Promise and Project Unicorn, that can help your district kind of start the process of beginning to make a data governance team.
Yeah, and you talk about collecting data. That kind of slides us into step number 2, where we talk about you recommending auditing your data. And again, so auditing, another kind of maybe intimidating phrase. I just think about my taxes, but really, what do you mean by auditing the data? Is it that collection and asking those stakeholders what data they use or what data they'd like to have?
I'll start out here and then I'll throw it over to Ryan. But a lot of districts are data slab. I know I was in a district where there's just data everywhere. It's not connected. No one knows how to access. No one knows who owns the data. So I think one of the biggest things is too to just start doing some data mapping, where you're just thinking about, all right, let's make a list of all the data that we're pulling, and then try to see kind of like overlap. Where does this data overlap? Where does it live? Are we collecting data that's even in the service of learning? Is there data that we are collecting that we don't even need anymore because it's not even something that we're looking at anymore? So I really think it's important to just stop and look at everything you have. And in that, you might find, oh, we're missing this data point. Oh, why are we still collecting this? And then you can actually kind of align that with some of your strategic goals and even purchases of platforms to make sure that you're collecting the data that you want. I'll kick it off to Ryan to weigh in on this too.
Yeah, thanks, Erica. And I am a recovering data slob. It makes me shudder to think how much time I spent sorting Excel spreadsheets, in order to get some of the insight that I wanted. And that's partly because we, add our data in too many places. So you're pulling things from, in my world, assessment data was critical for evaluating things like curriculum and instruction. So I'm pulling my state assessment, I'm pulling diagnostics and universal screeners, I'm looking at special education data, early literacy data. And if you don't have an idea of what's going to be your North Star, what's going to guide you, it's really easy to get overwhelmed with all of these different numbers. And what am I looking at and what do they actually mean? So I think when we talk about auditing your data, part of it is where is it, but also what matters? Like what matters the most? What is going to allow you to focus? Because there's lots out there, and making sure that you get a critical cross sample of things like assessment data, things like attendance, things like grades, other factors that are going to allow you to get a picture of how your district is performing and allow you to focus your resources accordingly.
Yeah. So sliding into step number 3 here, to determine data accessibility. What are we talking about there exactly? I mean, I guess that's something that you can do once you've done this audit, once you've come to see where this data is and how people enter it? Can you give us just a little more detail on what the day-to-day of that means, determine data accessibility?
Sure.
Eric, I'll
I mean,
put you on the hot seat on that one.
Sure. So there's actually two parts to it. So the first one is, there's a lot of turnover in districts, in all districts. And so when people are leaving, is their data access being turned off? How do you know this for sure? I think that's an important one. Who has access to the data? Is there a streamlined way if someone wants to get access to the data? Is there a system that you have in place to make sure that you are following the steps to give it to them appropriately? Is it accessible in different languages? So if it's a parent report, is it accessible in multiple languages, not just English? Because if you're sending a report home or if you're having parents log in, it's really important that they're able to really be able to understand that data and have access to it as well. And then finally, even I'm talking about giving access to students. I mean, really for me, and I think probably for Ryan too, the North Star is really like a whole learner report that kind of gives you like a bird's eye view of every data point you have on a student. I know I would love that for my own student. I want to know that they're succeeding academically, but I also want to know that they're, achieving social emotionally and attendance wise. I want to see kind of some sort of trajectory or path that they are on and be able to really understand that data. Now, Ryan, Kevin, I'm not sure about you, but Ryan and I, we live in data all day. So we can really easily look at a report and know exactly what it's talking about. But when you send that home to parents, I'm always the parent in my neighborhood. They're like, wait, I got this report on my kid. What does it mean? That shouldn't be happening. I think parents need to be able to really be able to access the data quickly, and teachers too. We always say like, all right, bring all the data you have on these students to your PLC. Why are we asking teachers to do that? It should just live in one place and it should just be accessible to them. They shouldn't be spending time ripping data from different silos and putting it together. That's not their job. Their job is to be able to access it and make quick decisions for instruction the next day. So that's what we mean by accessibility.
That makes it much more clear because, you're right. I mean, especially post-pandemic now, the parents have a much more involved dynamic, I think, when it comes to the students' journey, the learning journey. And when we're all forced remote, we were fed all these things, whether we liked it or not. And now that they're here, I mean, why not keep going? So that's a great one. Now, this next step, appoint a district data steward. I'm going to assume that anyone who's an audience member right now might be appointing themselves that district data steward title if they're here on an August afternoon talking about data governance, right? But give us a little bit more of a description of who that steward should be and what their responsibilities are.
So to me, the best district data steward is the one that always says no, because they should come from a place of no when it comes to protecting student data. A district data steward doesn't sound like a very exciting job, but it's actually a super important job. And I know a lot of districts do not have this role. It could be, because of resources and budget, but it's becoming more and more important to be able to have that one go-to person who is really the protector of your policies, of student data privacy. And the best ones come from a place of no. First, they say no, then they ask why. And then if you can convince them you need it. And I think that for me, that's really important. If you think about Ryan's job or my job or an administrator, principal, there's so many things you're dealing with on a daily basis. And then to be able to have to make quick decisions about data is one that's really hard to do. So you want to make sure that you have a district data steward who is very comfortable dealing with data, comfortable with the policies and systems in place. It doesn't sound like an exciting job, but I feel like district data stewards should be more celebrated. So if you're on this call and you are one, we definitely celebrate you.
Yeah, and Ryan, from the curriculum side, I mean, could that be could the data steward live in that land?
Yeah, it certainly could. I think that what you want with a role like this is someone who sort of feels comfortable moving through all elements of the school. And I think that's probably why I would not have been my own data steward at my district, because there are certain roles where you need to have a more lasered focus on one element of the district's priorities. And I think a data steward is someone who is comfortable and understands the way that teaching and learning happen in classroom, but also understands things like how your tech stack is designed and who's got access to what and how you set up roles to really access things in a critical way. So It's gonna differ from district to district, but really identifying a person who's a key fit for that, I think is critical, because what we're talking about here is don't just leave it to the whole team, because when you leave it to everybody, you're leaving it to nobody.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So that works. I'm assuming one of the responsibilities, where step number 5 in our 10 steps to data readiness is about educating your stakeholders. I would assume one of the responsibilities of that steward that would fall under their to-do list. We actually have a couple examples coming in from the audience. Thank you very much, about examples of how to educate the variety of stakeholders. And again, I guess we'll go back to those stakeholders being everyone from fellow administrators and faculty to students to parents. One of the audience members talked about how they put together a data day to support learners who are struggling. And that was from a special education teacher of middle school. Another example, another special educator talked about how they have a data notebook, which is an ongoing collection of their data. And could you guys talk a little bit about other examples about how to educate stakeholders?
I always try to start with connecting it to their real life. So when you start talking about data interoperability or data IO, you kind of get like, oh, I don't want to talk about that. But I always say to people, think about places in your life where you have the highest amount of data interoperability in your own personal life. Where is it? Think about it. It's shopping, right? I could buy anything from Amazon. The click of a button, it can get here in 2 hours. My credit card is loaded in there. My address is in there. There's such high interoperability of data there. Amazon shows me everything that I probably also wanted to buy that I didn't. So what we're trying to do is really replicate the ease, the actionability of that in education. And so I always want to start from that, making that personal connection of where in your life do you have the highest data interoperability, and then bring that into, that's really what we want to do for education, is to make sure that everything is accessible. And then also just really educate stakeholders on student data privacy and why it's important, because I feel like the more transparent you are about that, parents will be more willing to partner with you when they know what you're doing with the data, or teachers as well. So a lot about it is educating, especially the board member. Board members make decisions on purchasing and approvals of things. And they have to know that this is actually a really important thing that's going on in the state of education. I was just looking at something recently that there's been more bills passed on student data privacy in the past year than ever before. So it's definitely a hot topic, and making sure that everyone understands this is not just another trend in education or a buzzword. It's actually something that is going to be continuing to stay around forever.
Yeah, and I think the other piece of educating your stakeholders is knowing how to interpret the data to get what you need out of it. When we think about the sheer number of tasks that educators have to perform every day relative to what we were all trained on when we went through, our education teacher preparation programs, I don't know if I ever covered the difference between a percentage and a percentile. Or if I dug deeply into standards and the idea of like, what are critical standards versus what are supporting standards. And I think from a parent and student perspective, many people are mostly familiar with grades, right? I got a B. What does that mean though? What does that mean when you say you're struggling in a math? Is there a particular standard to work on, or a particular piece of data that you could look at? And so from the standpoint of working with teachers in districts, as we know, there's been lots of turnover. We have new, younger teachers entering the profession who maybe haven't encountered some of these data points before, or folks who have been in the profession for a while who are accessing new data from platforms that they haven't used before. So this idea of how do you interpret it to get what you want out of it is something that I always tried to keep in my mind when I was thinking about how we educated our stakeholders, whether that's staff, students, or parents.
Yeah, and it seems, this particular step is essential when we talk about the next step, which is where you're evaluating a district's data culture. Data really has been over the years sometimes been considered a dirty word. There are, especially when it comes to parents and worried about the security of the students' data, especially, and again, we have special educators on the call here. Especially when you get into data that might be on IEPs and where that information goes and how it's handled is something that has been a real concern and a legitimate concern. So, I mean, how do you evaluate a district's data culture? I mean, what does that mean? And I guess it depends on the level of education that data steward has been able to put forward. But Erica, maybe you can start us off and talk a little bit about what you mean by that.
I'll let Ryan handle this one.
Thanks, Erica. I think it's about it. That's why the first word in this step is evaluate, right? It's about taking a step back to say, like, let's truthfully look at the way that we use data in our district, because I hear lots of folks in education say we're data driven. What does that mean, though? Does that mean every year when you get your state summative scores, you kind of assign blame or assign accolades based on how many students are advanced and proficient? That's not data driven, right? That's punitive. And I think really honestly looking at what do we do when we're trying to evaluate whether a student is being successful or whether they're struggling. Do we have people looking at things like their grades, their assessment, their attendance, their performance on different platforms and things like that? And are we looking at it from the perspective of, again, how do we improve student outcomes? Or is this just, we kind of bring down the data hammer once a year? And once you've had that honest conversation, then you can really say, okay, where do we want to be? What are the most critical pieces we want to look at? How do we want to, because, I talked earlier about having your North Stars. What are the things that are going to guide you? And I remember speaking with an educator once who said, just keep the main thing the thing. And it was the message here being, there are lots of things that could guide you, but you have to pick what those things are and stick to them. If you're constantly shifting your focus or looking at something else, everyone's going to be, in the wind. And so saying, here's what we focus on at our district. Here's what our culture values. Here's how we move students forward. These are the critical pieces we're going to look at. We're going to educate our stakeholders on, and we're going to constructively have conversations around how we improve and not just use it from a punitive standpoint.
Yeah, I agree, Ryan. I think it's really important to do like a data equity walk too. So like, what are the norms when we talk about data? Are there norms? Everyone is, listening with an open mind. Everyone's, feelings or everyone's thoughts are accepted. I think a lot of times it takes kind of just building those norms into every meeting so that it's expected that we come and we're ready to talk about data, no matter if it's, something that might not look good. How are we going to fix it is really the main goal. So I think that's definitely, another important step.
One element of a district's culture, and I know in the past and why there's a lot of, or there has been in the past, teacher resistance to the use of data because they see themselves not as scientists as much as artists, right? I mean, this is the way I've taught my class for 15 years. I haven't needed a spreadsheet or a pie chart for me to be able to gauge the effectiveness of these things. How do you combat that to say this is actually something that is an enhancement as opposed to an obstacle?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think, again, it comes down to your culture of we always talked about the tools in our tool belt as educators. This is another tool that you have at your disposal. Data is not the only thing that is going to inform how your students are doing. Some of that artistry remains of that, you can't quantify everything that happens in a classroom. But there are things that quantifying helps. It helps guide you. It helps focus where you're planning your efforts and who needs extra support. And I think the culture, again, has to be one that is collaborative, where there's not blame assigned. And I always found utilizing the teachers in our district who had either had sort of that data awakening or had always sort of been consistently using it, of saying like, hey, I want to amplify your voice, right? This isn't just me saying, here's what we have to do, but in Ms. Hartman's class, here's what happens, and here's how she uses data to really work with targeted students. I'd love to turn the floor over to her and have her kind of share that with us. So I think, when it strictly comes from top down, and you're not highlighting the folks in your district who are really doing the work day in and day out, that puts you at a disadvantage from getting buy-in. And I think buy-in happens when you can, again, amplify all the voices who are working together.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's, always goes back to data in the service of learning. And I think students and teachers being able to really quickly visualize progress and see progress quickly. I mean, if you think about it, probably when we were in school, I remember taking one standardized test a year. That's the only data that I ever saw about myself. But if you could see your data, yourself improving, even if it's a tiny bit, 1% at a time over maybe a 3-month period, that's something that is motivating. And, because of technology, we have systems and platforms that give data right back to you in seconds, which, that is the beauty of technology and data. But I think really being able to visualize and see that progress happening in real time is actually pretty motivating for a lot of students.
Yeah, and for students themselves, I mean, I think thankfully, if we have this conversation in 10 years, we might not be talking about this, especially when it comes to students having an expectation of having these sorts of results, right? I mean, the younger people don't think that this is a novelty. They think that this is the way it should be. And I think that will creep in when you see younger faculty members and staff members coming on. This will be an expectation, not like kind of an added burden, right?
Yeah, and I would like to say I would love to see more done with pre-service teachers in data and learning how to read reports. I don't remember ever getting training on that. Not a knock to where I attended university, but I just don't think it was top of mind. But I would really love to see teachers that are still pre-service in college and university really start to be able to learn about data interoperability, about data in the service of learning, and how you can read reports, because they'll come in set up for success, not just learning how to read reports while you're right there in the midst of everything.
Yeah. So now that we've got the culture straightened out, we've got a data steward, we've audited where the data is, we can add in another stakeholder into the conversation here, which is your ed tech vendors, and about your goals in terms of what you want to do with this data that you've understood. Let's get in a little bit more detail of what you mean by the ed tech vendors and what that relationship looks like.
Ooh, this is my favorite one. So I really think that ed tech vendors have to be partners in education, not just a vendor selling a platform. And so really the vendor really needs to be able to listen and know the district's goals. What are they looking for? And be able to make sure that they showcase their product to help meet those goals. I will go back and say one of the best things we ever did was, before we renewed contracts 1 year, we made all of our vendors come on site in person, and we showed them what we wanted our student dashboard to look like. So we had this vision for this whole learner dashboard, and these are all the points of data that we wanted. And we had all these points of data with different vendors, but we wanted to get them on one screen. And just bringing them to the table and showing them, like, this is what we really want. This is our vision. How are you going to help us get to this main goal? And they were so appreciative of it, because they were like, well, you always talk about it, but we don't really know what you mean. So being able to see it as an actual mock-up was really helpful. And then they were a lot more open. So when we did ask for a feature request, or we asked for something like, all right, we understand why you want it. So I really think that you have to kind of sit down, get all your vendors in one place, be a really interesting day to get them all together talking. And if you can do this, show them, like, this is what we want to get to. How can you help us get there? And a lot of times they might have something, in production that they're like, oh, you know what? We have that in production. We'll be able to provide that to you. So I think it's a great exercise, not just for internally in a district, but bringing in those extra stakeholders, because they may be able to provide resources that you don't even know are available.
And I think, I can unfortunately provide an example of the opposite of that from my days, where I didn't inform a vendor about my goals at all. I evaluated the program and was very excited about what it was bringing, and we got it in place in the district. And I realized I had no access at the district level. It was purely a classroom level report, and so I felt like we were flying blind with this new initiative because we were not able to see how we were doing, and we didn't have that conversation at the start to say, hey, is this a part of what's going to come with this platform? And it made it very challenging for us, and ultimately decided not to continue that years later. And it was partly because not having done that due diligence at the beginning.
Yeah, and that kind of really feeds into our next step, where we're talking about assessing the data for the variety of stakeholders. And really, we're coming down back to the dashboards, right? I mean, back in the day, when we would evaluate ed tech software, the dashboards were kind of for the superintendents. Maybe they had a daily attendance dashboard. Maybe they had, a sort of a general district-wide sort of thing, but that wouldn't bleed down to a lot of the folks who need it, especially teachers in the classroom. Maybe we could talk a little bit about the evolution and how those dashboards are giving stakeholders better accessibility.
Yeah, for me, it's all about end user experience. But Ryan, you can jump in.
Well, I was just going to say, I think you're totally right, Kevin, that, we have more access throughout the hierarchy of a district than we've ever had before. And it's about, this comes back to some of our earlier steps about who's on the team, what's the most critical data to that. And then the logical next step is who needs to see what. I'm a high school teacher. I don't need to see our district's running records for primary school. I'm a building principal. I need to see my building, and I need to see all of my data within my building, and that's attendance and achievement and grades. And so, identifying who are those roles, who needs what, what's going to guide them, and then setting up your structures accordingly so that those folks are supported in interpreting and accessing that data is going to make things a lot more smooth.
Yeah, and Erica, you had some thoughts there too. No?
Yeah, I think just having focus groups, I think it's really important to have focus groups with students, with parents, with teachers on just like their end user experience overall. I think it's important to involve them in decision-making processes. So if you do find a solution that you are going to implement, or if you're writing an RFP, especially for something like a data dashboard, it's really, really important to involve anyone who might be touching the platform. Because we all know that if it's one extra click, someone's not going to go there. It has to be easy, it has to be actionable, and it has to be a good experience. I feel like, there's so many different platforms in a district tech stack, from the SIS to the learning management system. How are you going to drive the usage of another platform if it's not easy to use and it's not intuitive? So I always like to think to really include anyone who might be touching the product in the evaluation and making sure that it's easy for them to use, because ease of use, when there's so many platforms out there, is going to be super important.
Yeah, and another aspect to the accessibility and to what stakeholders you're talking about, how important is it to get into the minutia? So again, I mean, we're talking about the data, right? So maybe we're talking about scores. Is it better to have that data be interpreted into, what is it? It's data, information, knowledge, right? So maybe we're not talking about pumping up a spreadsheet of daily formative assessment numbers. I guess the best analogy is kind of the red light, yellow light, green light equivalent to what those numbers mean. Can you talk about how that has become more sophisticated over the years and maybe gives more accessibility to all these stakeholders? You're both thinking, who wants to do it first?
I want to make sure I'm understanding the question right, and kind of thinking when I hear the stoplight analogy, I think of those like, things like risk factors, right? Like what are we weighting as the most significant pieces of data that we want to view for students, and at what point do we intervene? Like, at what point do we say, hey, this student needs some additional attention, this class needs some additional attention, this grade level as a whole? I've told this example frequently that it took me several years of looking at our 7th grade statistics scores to understand that the reason that our 7th graders were struggling wasn't because of anything that our 7th grade teachers were doing. It was because our 6th grade unit on statistics and math was always the last unit of the year. It was cut short by graduation. It wasn't so, but it took years of sort of that red flag for us to be able to connect those dots. And I think when you set up the appropriate filters or warning signs or risk factors, whatever you want to call them, it allows you as whatever your role may be, teacher, administrator, district leader, to know what you're looking for and take action more quickly.
And it seems like you have to balance this fine line between being proactive versus reactive, and otherwise, you said punitive, right? I mean, in terms of you're looking for the problem, but it's in order to actually discover a solution, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, with that example I shared, that came from us involving the middle school teachers and saying like, hey, here's this red flag that we have. We don't think we have a problem with instruction. We know we have a great group of staff. Our students are doing well in other areas. Let's look at this together. What is the issue? And so it's about that collaborative nature of working on something to find a solution and not to assign blame.
So now that works us into step number 9, which also can be a sticky wicket when it comes to districts and their politics and their relationships with school boards, and just policies are they can be inane, but they're essential, right? I mean, none of this stuff, when you talk about creating culture and educating stakeholders, can happen if you don't have some sort of policy infrastructure to keep everything in check.
Exactly. And another kind of a mundane topic, but it's important to make sure you're reviewing policies at least annually, whether it's from federal or from state or your district, making sure that everything is up to date. And on the other side too is, what are the policies of the ed tech vendors that you're engaging with? Who owns the data? If they suddenly shut down, where does your data live? Can you access it? Are they going to send it to you in a PDF or or a CSV file? I think it's really important to always make sure that your ed tech vendor is clear and transparent about what they're doing with the data, where they're storing it. And, a lot of times you get overpromise and underdeliver. Oh yes, we can integrate this, we can integrate that for you. Don't worry, we'll get this done. But can they really show that they can do it and in a timely manner as well? So I think it's important not just to review the policies of student data privacy and collecting data on students, but also looking on the vendor side and evaluating what they're doing with the data, how they're doing it, and how they're able to integrate all the data together.
And is this falling on the data steward? Or does someone else get to manage the policy?
It's a team effort. I would say it's a data steward and the CTO. I think it's definitely, you go back to your data governance team. This is what you bring to your data governance team. That's the purpose of having the governance team. They can all review the policies from a different lens, and they can all get a demo and talk to vendors as well. So I think this really goes back to why you need a data governance team, because this is not the work that just one person can do, and it has to be done collectively.
Yeah. And is this annual, semi-annual, quarterly, weekly? I mean, what's the dynamic when you see that team and that steward having conversations?
I think it's definitely an annual thing, for sure. When it
I would
comes to
agree.
reviewing policies.
But I think anytime that you have, let me use the word red flag again, something that comes up, it dictates being flexible, right? Especially if this is early in your data interoperability journey, or your, the way the district is coming together, is you don't have to wait until next year's policy review if something's not working. Not that you want to be changing everything, on the drop of a dime, but if it's clear to all stakeholders, if it's clear to the team that you made a decision that's not working, address it. Don't let it go too long, because then this is where you have people with bad experiences where data is being used punitively, or you're looking at the wrong data and not making the right decisions for students. So I agree with Erica that it should be a formalized process that you're looking at yearly, but don't back yourself into a corner where you feel like you can't take action to make better choices for students.
Yeah, so some folks from the audience are chiming in here saying that they do their day-to-days quarterly in terms of reviewing updates and changes. Another panelist, they're meeting with different staff members regarding their reports on a regular basis. That's beyond just that annual. So maybe as the culture develops, people become more comfortable with it. It just kind of becomes part and parcel of their day-to-day duties. I mean, that would be the ultimate goal, right? So we've worked through this list from 1 to 10. applying an equity lens to your data. This is kind of an interesting aspect, one that I wouldn't have thought of immediately when I think about the concepts of equity, which for me, even before the pandemic, was always kind of a squishy conceptual thing. Once we got through the past number of years, it's turned into, a true reality. It became a stark reality during the pandemic of the issues surrounding equity. But Erica, how does this equity lens apply to a district's data?
I think really seeing how data affects everyone differently is important, and making sure that you're being inclusive of everyone's viewpoint. And that's why I think I'd like to go back to the data equity walk. I think that was one of the activities that we did in our district that was really eye-opening, is that we actually took student data reports and blacked out the students' names so that you couldn't see, any of the identifiers, and just everyone walked around and wrote notes about what they saw and how the data made them feel. And it was really interesting that everyone had a different viewpoint. And when you really include a lot of different, backgrounds and experiences, you're going to see that, you have to also have an empathetic lens when it comes to data, because it affects everyone differently. And, it can mean something different for everyone. I'll pass it over to Ryan too, to add his thoughts in.
Yeah, I think, one of the most important questions we asked in my district when we were looking at data, and I saw someone in the chat talk about their data-days when we were analyzing it, is what do you notice? And if you have the right data points coming in, if you have that associated with different demographics and student identifiers and things like that, you can have really deep conversations with staff around this idea of equity and how we're approaching student needs in an equitable way. And I'll use another example from our time of really identifying that we were not doing a good enough job of supporting students who had IEPs in our district, and that became a focus for us. It became something that was clear in our data, and it allowed us to take action in providing professional development on universal design for learning, and how do we make sure that all teachers are considering this their problem and not this is just the special educator's problem. And I think that came from starting with just let's look at what trends are we seeing, what do we notice, and then from there taking action as a community and as a team. And that's what we mean when we say applying an equity lens. Are there outliers? Are there student groups? Are there teacher or parent groups who are not who are not being reflected the way that you want in your data? And then what do you do about that? Again, not from a punitive standpoint, but from a collaborative standpoint of this is where we want all students in our district to be.
Yeah. Now, while we've worked our way through this list, Ryan, I know you have a few other thoughts that you wanted to share. If we want to move over to those slides.
Yeah, well, I love talking about this topic. I love the idea of guiding educators through this process of making data more usable and actionable. And at Edulastic, one of the things that we've brought to our assessment product is Data Studio, and this idea of being able to take data, regardless of where it comes from, different platforms, different places within the school, and bring it all together in one source. It is something that I wish I had when I was working in my district, so I wasn't playing with Excel spreadsheets all year. But this idea of I can look at achievement, I can look at attendance, taking a look at where students are performing on my internal assessments versus some of those larger scale state summative data, universal screeners, whatever it might be, putting it all together in one spot, and being able to identify who's progressing, who needs additional support, where can we focus our resources. And we're really excited to be able to work with districts on making this data journey a little easier, so that once you've gone through these 10 steps, you've identified your team, you've pulled it together, you know what your most critical data points are, that you then don't have all of the burden of saying, well, how do we display this? How do we look at this? And that's what Data Studio does. It provides access to the folks within your district to what they need. whether that is at a student level or all the way up at a very high level of a district view. And analyzing things like student attendance, student risk, being able to set intervention plans for students and be able to track progress on those interventions is such a valuable tool and a valuable resource for districts that are going through this data journey. So we're really excited to be able to partner with districts around the country on taking this step towards their data journey, and Data Studio being the tool to provide that. And one of the things we talked a little bit, Kevin, I think this got at your question earlier, was just how do you know, where's that red light, yellow light, green light? And one of the key pieces of putting all this data together in one spot is then being able to set those lights within what are the parameters within your district where we say, hey, this is green. This group of students is really progressing well. Yellow, this is a group that we need to watch. And red, these are students who we need to get on board together as a community and figure out a better way to support. And that comes down to our last point of applying that equity lens of saying, all right, the data is not where we want it to be. Now what? What do we do about that? And being able to set those goals for students and make sure that you're making progress is one of the key parts of being a data ready district, because you don't want to just have it all together in one spot to look at it. You want to be able to do something with it so that you can support those student outcomes.
Now, we talk about accessibility, and you talk about this sort of dashboard and display. Is this something that you see being available to everyone throughout a district, or set various levels? Give us a little bit more particulars there.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's something this was designed with the feedback of educators in both part of the process as well as in mind, as we've heard from our conversations around the country. And we realized not everyone needs access to the same things. And so that's why you have role-based access where a teacher can see what they need to see, a principal can see what they need to see, the district can see what they need to see. And you also have the ability to be able to share reports. So you can make things available to students and to families. And that's really where that sort of granular view becomes more powerful, because you're focused in on those most important metrics that you need.
Well, great. And now I knew the toughest part of my job this afternoon was going to be to end the conversation. There's so many different elements of data governance that we could go on for a while, but as we start to reach to the top of the hour, maybe I'll ask Brian and Erica, both of you, to look at the horizon. I mean, now we've kind of come out of the pandemic here, and we have whatever our new normal is. Maybe there's a new kind of culture in districts and people understanding the importance of, through that remote learning experience, and maybe sharing data that way. Maybe we've gone past that resistance level of conversation when it comes to data. Where do you see the state of play when it comes to data governance in the next 2 to 3 years going forward? Give us a little bit of your crystal ball. Eric, I'll put you on the hot seat first.
I mean, for me, it's got to get into the students' hands. I think, when I think about my own children, they have Fitbits, they have Peloton, they know how much screen time they're using, but nobody really ever talks to them about their educational data. And I think, we are at the point where, students can start to be little data scientists. You don't have to have a data science degree. You don't have to know how to use Tableau anymore. And, these are becoming more and more easy to read. I think ultimately being able to get information into students' hands and then having them, work together to really set their own path and see, maybe, all right, depending on this data point, maybe my path is this way, and really start to incorporate a lot of more maybe career interests into data too, to kind of help them guide their path forward, is really what I would like to see.
That's a really good point. It reminds me of a few years ago, my daughter was in the car with me and she was staring at her phone, right, as teenagers are wont to do, and as a parent, as I was wont to do, is say, "You're always staring at your screen. What are you doing on that screen?" And she put it up to me, and it was all of her AP scores had just come in, and she was analyzing her own learning journey on her phone. So I think, yeah, that's entirely correct. I mean, just have them feel empowered with this stuff too. is essential. Ryan, what about you?
Yeah, I think to me, it comes down to transforming the way that we use data in schools from being one of diagnosis to one of action based perspective. And I think actionable data is where I see more districts and more educators going. Erica talked about the Fitbit analogy, right? It doesn't do you any good if you get a report at the end of the year that says you walked 18 million steps, right? But getting that data every day and saying, hey, I haven't moved at all today. Like, I want to get up. My average is this. This is where I want to be. That's helpful, right? I can do something about that. And I think for a long time in schools, we've approached data from the standpoint of, let's look at this at the end. Let's see how things went. What was our attendance for the year? What was our state summative data looking like? What do we do next year? And instead, we're going to see more day-to-day, week-to-week, quarter-to-quarter analysis, and allowing educators and students to pivot more quickly. And I think that's what's really exciting about being able to see your data all together in one spot, is you can make those more nimble moves that allow you to do better by students.
Yeah. Well, I'd like to thank Erica and Ryan today for this really informative presentation. And I'd like to thank all the audience members for joining us as well. Your insights, I think, really helped guide us into what was a terrific conversation. As a reminder, you'll be getting an email within the next few days that contains a link to this recording along with the slides. Thanks again, everyone, for participating, and have a great day.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, guys.